Okay, welcome back everybody. I'm just going to share Pavan's presentation. Okay, is that all right for you, Pavan?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, thank you.
Lovely. So Pavan is going to be speaking about breaking stereotypes and misconceptions on language used around autism. Pavan is an autism advocate, over 9,000 followers on Twitter, which you may mention, and a young ambassador for the National Autistic Society as well. So over to you, Pavan.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about the importance of language when talking about autism. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So I'm Pavan. I'm a 17-year-old autistic person. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2018. I'm currently an A-level student studying economics, maths and chemistry. I also have several different roles, mainly around advocacy and making the world a better place for autistic people. I'll talk about this more in the next coming slides. I'm also very active with autism advocacy on social media, and I have my social media handles below. Next slide, please. So I work at YHA, which is the Youth Hostels Association. I'm a youth advisory team member at the Youth Hostels Association, and it's a team of 14 young people whose aim is to make youth hostels in England and Wales a better place for young people. Now, with my autistic experience, what I'm trying to do is make youth hostels a better place for autistic people, sensory wise, and also accessibility for them. I spoke at a conference last month in Edale in the Peak District, Derbyshire, about making national parks and youth hostels more accessible for disabled people, including autistic people. It was a great conference and I got a massive standing ovation, and there were loads and loads and loads of people there. It was a great experience. And I'm back doing more YHA work in West Yorkshire next week and in the Lake District next month. Next slide, please. And as you can see from my wonderful NAS t-shirt, I am a young ambassador for the National Autistic Society. We got about 25 young ambassadors who were appointed last month, and we are trying to provide youth voice and to make the world a better place for young autistic people. So I will be undertaking some society's social media channels and their website, and maybe even have involvement in some of their programs like Spectrum Live, which you might have seen during COVID. As young ambassadors, we have one primary aim: to make this world a better place for autistic people, no matter what it takes. Next slide, please. So some other things I do, I'm an advisor for the Department for Education's SEND reforms, so that stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. I do this via the National Children's Bureau. So as you probably know, recently the SEN Send review has come out about 2 or 3 days ago. You might have read it already. So I'll be taking part in the consultation period over the next 3 months and reviewing what's good about it and what's not so good about it and what could be improved, and feeding back to the ministers at the Department for Education. And so far in my role, I had the pleasure to speak to two ministers, Vicky Ford, who's the MP for Chelmsford and a former Minister for Children, and Will Quint, who is the MP for Colchester and the current Minister for Children. And I have also been fortunate to meet several senior civil servants and talked about improving SEND reforms and what should improve both from other people's experiences that I read about and also my own experiences. In my spare time, I do lots and lots of travel. I visited every London Underground station, every London Overground station, and every London tram stop. And I'm also taking part in a challenge to visit every National Rail station in Britain. And I so far have been to 509, which is amazing. So we are gonna now get started into the main content, which is talking about language around autism. So next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about two types of language today. Firstly, outdated language. So this is any language which was commonly used in the past due to the diagnostic criteria at that time, which has been quite ableist, to be honest, so discriminatory of disabled people. It commonly missed autistic girls. It was very gender biased, which I will talk about later. And the way autism was diagnosed, but should no longer be used anymore due to the way attitudes around autism have evolved and changes in the diagnostic criteria. I'm also going to be talking about stigmatizing / ableist language, so language which has commonly been used in the past, and unfortunately sometimes I still see it being used today and has never been okay, regardless of the time that it was / has been used, or is ableist today but wasn't seen as ableist in the past due to attitudes around autism at that time. Next slide, please. So I'm going to firstly start off by talking about autism and mental health, and firstly I'm going to remind people that autism is not a mental illness and is not a mental health problem, even though it's commonly seen as one due to the way some autism traits like sensory meltdowns are seen as having a mental health problem, but in reality, sensory meltdowns have nothing to do with poor mental health. So when an autistic person is struggling with mental illness, it's important not to link this with autism being a mental illness. Both can coincide. We call that comorbidity, but they're not the same thing. Terminology like mentally ill, mentally retarded, mentally handicapped shouldn't be used towards autistic people. And in fact, I would strongly advise that those terms are never used towards people struggling with any mental illness, regardless of whether they are autistic or not. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to firstly talk about previous names used to diagnose autism. So as you probably know, it used to be called Asperger's syndrome. However, this has since recently been changed, I think a couple of years ago, can't remember when exactly, but it has been recently changed to ASD, which stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. Now, I do not like this name to refer to autism and autism diagnoses, and I will explain why in more detail in the next slide. In 2018, a research paper was published about the history of Hans Asperger, who is the person from whom Asperger syndrome was named after, and I have put a link to the paper on my presentation, and it basically outlines the relationship that Hans Asperger had with the Nazi Party. Since this was published, attitudes around the term Asperger syndrome changed significantly, and rightfully so. And I'm going to now read a short extract from that paper about the damning truth of Hans Asperger. So here we go. So Asperger managed to accommodate himself to the Nazi regime and was rewarded for his affirmations of loyalty with career opportunities. He joined several organizations affiliated with the NSDAP, although not the Nazi Party itself, publicly legitimized race hygiene policies, including forced sterilizations, and on several occasions actively cooperated with the child euthanasia program. The language he employed to diagnose his patients was often remarkably harsh, even in comparison with assessments written by the staff at Vienna's notorious Spiegel Grund Euthanasia Institution, belying the notion that he tried to protect children under his care by embellishing their diagnosis. Really, really alarming and gruesome stuff there. It's the real truth about him. I also want to, before I move on, I also want to say that some people think Asperger syndrome is a rare form of autism, but no, it's not. It was just a former name for the diagnosis of autism. So now in the next slide, I'm going to be talking about why I don't really like the term ASD to refer to autism. So next slide, please. So autism spectrum that is being used to formally diagnose autism. I don't really like it because of the negative connotations that the word disorder has. Ooh, thank you. Disorder has, and how this would affect the way some people see autism. So, for example, when people call it a disorder, they may think that it's a bad thing or an illness, but in reality, it isn't any of that, and that's why the negative connotations to this are so alarming. In fact, the dictionary definition of disorder, according to Google, is an illness or condition that disrupts normal physical or mental functions. This is certainly not what autism should be described as. That definition also suggests that autism is something that needs fixing or curing. Autism doesn't need fixing or curing at all because it's not an illness or disease. The use of the word disorder is in DSM-5, which is, if you might know it, the manual used to diagnose autism, and the use of that word actually adds stigma around autism. Just diagnosing it as autism would suffice. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about language around autism traits and certain guidelines around it. So firstly, it's not okay to say symptoms of autism or autism symptoms, because the use of such terminology suggests that autism is an illness or disease, and it's not. And also the use of such terminology also suggests that autism is something that needs curing, and actually it isn't. The correct language that I have used above is traits of autism / autism traits. It's also okay to say characteristics of autism and autism characteristics. It's also okay to say behaviors of autism / autism behaviors, but I tend to see traits more commonly used and it tends to be more preferable. Finally, any language which makes autism sound like it's an illness or disease shouldn't ever be used. Next slide, please. So I would like you to take 2 minutes to just have a look at these headlines and process them and think about what is common about these headlines and what is wrong with them. Oh, sorry, next slide. Thank you.
We could get people to comment in the chat if you wanted.
Yeah. Can we can also have comments in the chat and to see what you think about it. Yeah.
So someone said, is it focusing on male diagnosis rather than lack of female diagnosis? Question mark.
Yes, that's right. It's linked to that. Yes, you're right. Yeah. Forward arrow, please, to bring up the information below. Thank you. So the commonality between all the headlines is that they all misinterpret the real truth about the amount of autistic people of every gender. They think that there are more autistic boys than girls, but what's the reality? Let's take a look in the next slide. So next slide, please. So as you have seen in the previous slide, there are several myths reported around the amount of autistic people. So the first one is there aren't more autistic boys than girls, as the previous slide with the article's headline suggested. The reality is that more autistic boys are actually being diagnosed than girls. In 1981, Lorna Wing, who was one of the co-founders of the National Autistic Society, said that boys are 15 times more likely to be autistic than girls. And this is wrong, actually. In fact, there is an equal chance of boys, girls, and all other genders to be autistic. And the reality is that more autistic girls are going undiagnosed due to the way they mask and the way the autism diagnostic criteria is adapted so that it only diagnoses one specific combination of autism traits that is more common in boys than girls, and this is called gender bias, as I was talking about earlier at the beginning. Now, there is an absolutely wonderful charity. I'm very much involved in their Facebook group, and it's called Autistic Girls Network, and it campaigns to make sure that more autistic girls get diagnosed earlier so that they can get the support they deserve from an earlier age, rather than autistic girls getting diagnosed later after lots of burnout and mental health problems, which is really bad. So next slide, please. So these are some tweets I written last year about the use of language and interpretation of autism statistics and the myths around that. So I'm going to read them out. So the one on the left says, myth, there are more autistic boys than autistic girls. Fact, there are more diagnosed autistic boys than diagnosed autistic girls. And the one on the right says, myth, boys are more likely to be autistic than girls. And truth, the diagnostic criteria for some autism professionals to diagnose autism makes boys more likely to get an autism diagnosis than girls. Forward arrow, please, to bring the information below. Thank you. So my takeaway point from this part of the presentation would be, don't take autism statistics as overall number of autistic people. In reality, they show the overall number of diagnosed autistic people. Due to the amount of autistic people who go undiagnosed, it would be absolutely impossible to say how many autistic people there are overall. Next slide, please. So you may have heard the terms high functioning autism and low functioning autism being used quite often. In fact, when I was diagnosed autistic, my diagnosis was high functioning autism, and it really affected the way I was treated, and I received a lot of ableist treatment everywhere as a result of this. Now I'm going to display up an amazing quote that I found, and this will really make you reflect on why, as autistic people, we do not like functioning labels. So forward arrow, please. Okay, I'll give you 30 seconds to read that quote and process it and really reflect on it. And I will, and please feel free to comment in the chat about what you think about it. So I'm going to read it aloud. So it says, the difference between high functioning autism and low functioning is that high functioning means your deficits are ignored and low functioning means your assets are ignored. And this is so true. Like because of my diagnosis of high functioning autism, sometimes the things I struggle with are ignored completely because of that term high functioning, and because of that I am always seen as a person who never struggles, and it also means that I have to mask my autism more often in order for people to not be ableist to me. So next slide, please. So again, here are some more tweets that I've written about my personal views on functioning labels. So the one on the left says, high functioning autistic people are constantly expected to function at the highest level 24/7. Low functioning autistic people are constantly seen as a burden to society. This is why functioning labels are so harmful. And the one on the right says, I'm a high functioning autistic person according to my autism diagnosis, and today I have literally barely functioned. I have got absolutely nothing done today. Some days I'm high functioning, but since struggling with mental illness, most days I barely function. So this really sums up my experiences of functioning labels and why they're so harmful. And I want to finish off this part by saying, adding to this, our autistic lives involve functioning at various levels every day. We don't live our full lives functioning in only one certain way throughout. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk about the harms associated with the puzzle piece symbol. So you may have seen in some posters or some websites the use of the puzzle piece symbol to represent autism. However, lots of autistic people strongly condemn the use of the puzzle piece symbol to represent autism. Now, this is because it shows that autistic people are broken, are a problem, and that autistic people need fixing. But no, this is not true, and a very ableist take on autism. This symbol, as I said, shows that we're broken, and it's a very ableist and disrespectful symbol towards autistic people. And it's a symbol that is endorsed by a really, really well-known bad organization called Autism Speaks, which is based in the USA. In fact, it's actually their logo, a blue puzzle piece, and it is widely hated by autistic people due to their mistreatment of autistic people and their endorsement of curing and eradicating autism. So another one of my takeaway points is to never endorse Autism Speaks ever. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about person first language. So this is things like person with autism, people with autism, you know, so it's the opposite of saying autistic person. Now, personally, my view on this is that it's something that makes me feel uncomfortable because of the way it feels like it's separating autism from my identity, and being called autistic person is more commonly preferred amongst autistic people. So I put out a tweet about a week ago where where it was an asking autistics tweet. So that means it's where you ask autistic people for their views. So I got some quotes from autistic people on Twitter on why they don't endorse the use of person first language. So I have got, I think, 5 quotes I have got, and some are in the next slides as well. So the first quote says, I have been removed from being autistic in different ways, told not to stim, make eye contact, etc. I feel like I am connected to it. Autistic is a part of me. Person with autism feels like separating me from a big part of who I am and hiding it. And that's from at C11941776. So I absolutely love that quote. I think that is absolutely spot on and so relatable. Next slide, please. So here's some more quotes. So the next one says, we are told not to say autistic person as we mustn't let autism define us. The idea that autism shouldn't define us is rooted in the belief that being autistic makes us lesser. Person first language is a red flag for identifying people who see autism as a negative thing. Another amazing quote, and it's from someone who has quite a big following on Twitter and someone who I know really well. So at A Healy RIBA, so Angela Healy, that is an absolutely wonderful autism advocate she is. So the next one says, I don't carry autism around in my pocket. It's not something I have. It's not with me. It is me. I'm autistic. Saying you have autism is not like saying you have brown hair. It's not descriptive as it's invisible. Saying you have it pathologizes it rather than normalizing it. So that's from Ida Newley. So that is another wonderful quote. I really like the part where they said it's not something I have, it's not with me, it is me. Yes, because I don't live with autism. Autism is my identity. I'm autistic. You can't separate it from me. So that's why I really love that quote so much. So Next slide, please. So the next one says, I am autistic, not a person with autism. If it was somehow possible to remove the autism, I would be a completely different person. I love that quote as well, because personally, I believe that if autism is removed from me, I would have no identity. I wouldn't know who I am. I would, as they said, I would be a completely different person. It's so true. And the last quote says, autism has always been and will always be a part of me. It influences my experience, my perspective, and my personality. I am not afflicted with autism and I'm not ashamed of it. I shouldn't be made to feel ashamed of who I am. I am an autistic woman, and that comes from an account called at Finally Autistic. I must admit that I absolutely love her account and absolutely love that Twitter handle. It's an amazing account, and what a wonderful quote to sum up why, as some autistic people do not endorse person first language. So next slide, please. So I'm going to summarize my whole presentation. So firstly, autistic people do not endorse the use of any language that is ableist or makes us stand out to be bad people. So we don't like such language. Language preferences vary amongst autistic people. However, my presentation today talks mainly about ableist and unacceptable language, and language which is and isn't endorsed by the majority of autistic people. However, here's one really important point that I would like you to take away today. Especially with person first language, it's always best to respect the most common language preference for them, whether it's autistic, sorry, it's always best to respect the most common language preference, whether it's autistic person or person with autism. And it's always best to go for what the majority of autistic people prefer, which is autistic person, if you don't know what their language preference is. So in other words, what I'm saying is, some people may prefer to be called autistic person. Some people may be preferred to be called person with autism, and you always got to respect their language preference, whatever it is. So I would say you got to take that point really seriously. So next slide, please. So that's the end of the presentation. Now I think I have finished about 25 minutes early, which is great because it gives me plenty of time to answer your questions for the next 25 minutes about anything related to autism, the things I do, the advocacy work I do, or my experiences, or school, or anything. Like, I'm happy to take questions for the next 25 minutes about anything related to autism. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavan. And there's been some great comments already in the chat, saying one of the quotes that you gave was really great, makes you think, and very true. High and low functioning terminology is used way too commonly. We've got somebody from a school that they said they're watching, and I think an old teacher, Mrs. Collins, is very proud of you.
Yeah.
Nice to hear. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions coming in, but while we're waiting, I've got a few to ask you. So one I was going to ask, which is, what do you think has helped to give you a positive understanding of your autistic identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So personally, what helped me is joining social media, joining autism groups. So mixing with other autistic people on platforms platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and really communicating and learning about other people's experiences being autistic. And it also really helped me to shape me up and feel like a more confident autistic person. I also am in touch with autistic people and have made friends in my workplaces like YHA and the National Autistic Society, and they're absolutely wonderful people, and they gave me a lot to look forward to in life and really gave me an impression that it is entirely possible to live a fulfilling life even as an autistic person. So that's a great question. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. So it's really important to have that sense of community and a feeling of purpose.
Exactly. I love community, I really do. The autism community on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, and the workplaces I work at. It's absolutely wonderful. It really, really is. Yeah.
And we've seen that shift, haven't we, in recent years, or well, in your lifetime, really, from it being about professionals or experts talking about autism, often medical professionals, which links with the language you were talking about,
Yeah.
to actually autistic individuals having a voice, and that being really important, that those voices are heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you on that. We need more autistic voices talking about autism. Nothing about autism without autistic people. That's what I say.
It's one of your favorite quotes, isn't it, that
It's
one?
one of my favorite quotes, trust me, it really is.
And somebody else said brilliant presentation. Thank you, Pavan. Another question I thought of was, I wonder if you can think of just three things.
Yeah.
Three things, or three top things, that would make a more inclusive autistic, or an inclusive society for autistic individuals.
That's a great question. So, firstly, I would say more autism acceptance campaigns, so not just focusing on awareness, but actually getting more people to understand autism, so that then they know better about how they can make the world a better place for autistic individuals. So we really, really need to move on from the idea of autism awareness, and thanks to lots of campaigning, the National Autistic Society have renamed it Autism Acceptance Week, which is amazing, because in the past they used to call it Autism Awareness Week, and I always thought the narrative of awareness is just useless, really, because what's the point when, because people know that autism exists. I mean, if 99.99% of people know that autism exists, so what's the point of making people more aware of autism? So we need to shift to actually getting more people to understand autism and accept autism. So that's my first point. Secondly, sensory environment. So we need to, so for the world to be a better place for autistic individuals, we need more people actually catering and accommodating for the sensory needs, and not just saying that, you know, not just treating it as if it's a petty thing, because I know for some neurotypicals I have come across, they always think that sensory things are little and are trivial and unimportant, but in reality sensory is a big part of us, and it's important that the sensory environment is accommodative of us. So that would be my second point. And finally, getting more autistic people to get involved in talking about autism campaigns. So in other words, like you said, just not, you know, giving autistic people the steering wheel of talking about autism, and not like in the past where it used to be just professionals making the decisions or doing the campaigns. We actually need to get more autistic people involved to make this society a better place for autistic people. So I would say those are my 3 main points of making autistic people a better environment and the world being a better place for autistic people. Yeah.
Thank you. I did put you on the spot a bit there, so I'm impressed that you managed to just pick on 3. Very well done.
Thank you.
And another thing I thought of, because you referred to ableism, and I wonder if people will be aware of what ableism means. So perhaps you could explain that.
Yeah, I did say it briefly, but I can explain it again. It's basically when you discriminating against disabled people. So for example, when sometimes when I'm outside with my sunflower lanyard on, some people tend to just stay away from me or just avoid me or look at me with suspicious facial expressions, and it suggests that it makes me feel like I'm the odd one out in society, but in reality autistic people shouldn't be made to feel ashamed of themselves and their identity. So that's one really big example of ableism that I personally faced as an autistic person in society. Yeah, thank you. Great
Thank you.
question.
Yeah, and doesn't it link as well to the kind of adaptations that are being made? So the focus maybe being on the autistic person has to change. So like you said about the sensory differences, that I guess
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
ableist, they'll just, well, it's not that loud, don't worry about it, rather than
Yeah,
acknowledging
I
that
know.
actually you could change the environment for that person.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, some people, you know, with some neurotypicals, because of sensory differences, they for them it might be all right, it might not be too loud, but for us autistic people, it is ear piercing and sensory hell. So yeah, it is really important to accommodate for sensory differences, especially because of the way neurotypicals and autistic people perceive and experience senses in different ways. So yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, have you seen what the latest message in the chat says? It says Pavan for PM.
Oh my God, thank you. That means so much. Thank you.
Just shows how well you've spoken and all the great resources you've shared. Someone else said, yeah, great presentation, sharing all helpful information. There's lots of useful links on there as well, I think, to other people's Twitter accounts. That's a really good way to learn more and hear from different people's perspectives. Louise, while Pavan's planning his PM campaign, are there any other questions?
There's none and no more in the chat, but I've actually got one.
Oh, lovely.
I remember hearing a couple of years ago, people started using the term ASC, autism spectrum condition. I wondered what your thoughts were on that language.
That's a good question. It's not perfect, I mean, but it is more acceptable than calling it a disorder. Calling it a disorder suggests that it's a really bad thing and it's an illness and a disease, when it isn't any of that. If there's no other alternatives, then calling it autism spectrum condition, personally for me, is more preferable than calling it autism spectrum disorder. So yeah, I would prefer it being called ASC if there are no other viable alternatives, and I can't think of any, or just call it autism simply. That also makes more sense. Yeah, just call it autism, just call it that. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant.
though, great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you.
People like an acronym, don't they? They like to shorten it to something.
Yeah, it's only 6 letters. What's wrong with that?
I know. Like you say, just stick with autism. It's much simpler.
Yeah, just stick with autism, exactly. 6 letters. What's hard about it?
Exactly. Right, thank you. One more message in the chat. Okay, so that's a question. So someone says, I am the mum of an autistic teenager, and currently she doesn't have access to social media because I'm worried about the effect on her mental health. What advice would you give about online safety for young people? It's a good question.
That's a great question, actually. Firstly, personally, I would say, and I've done this with my Facebook account. If you don't want to become a public person, then best you keep it private. And if you keep it private, then you can accept and decline follow requests, and in that way it will reduce the amount of interactions with unfamiliar people or people who could make you feel uncomfortable. So keeping your accounts private is one thing. Number 2, I done this on my Twitter account. Block so there's a setting where you can actually toggle it so that you don't actually allow any DMs from anybody who you aren't following. So I found that really helpful because it means that I don't get any spam DMs in my big Twitter account, because anybody who I don't follow cannot DM me at all. And finally, if anyone's making you feel uncomfortable, then just block them. I mean, in the past, I made the huge mistake in life of allowing people who are making me feel uncomfortable and who are breaching my boundaries to actually interact with me further. And to be honest, I strongly don't recommend such things because it has been quite detrimental to my mental health, and especially having a big following, 9,200 plus on Twitter, it makes me more prone to attacks, harassment, that. So it's always best to just use the block button straight away if anybody is making you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So I would say those are my 3 main pieces of advice of staying safe on social media.
Thank you. And DMs are direct messages, just in case.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
How would you balance that though, Pavan? Because sometimes people think, well, it's not worth the stress of possibly getting horrible messages like that. How do the two weigh up? Has it been of value to you to be on social media, even with those slightly negative messages?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, to be honest, it takes a lot of resilience to have 9.2k followers and be very public. But in reality, I would personally say that because people who I don't follow cannot DM me, it reduces the risk of such attacks happening in my DMs. And in case somebody who I am following DMs me with an attacking message, then I can just block them straight away, and that's it. And it reduces the risk of me feeling at threat or feeling vulnerable to grossly insulting DMs, direct messages. So yeah, that's personally what I would say. Yeah.
So the benefits for you of those sites outweigh the risks.
Yeah. It outweighs the risks because of the way I can actually, I'm in control. You see, if you're in control, as long as you're in control, it's fine. The minute you go out of control, then that's where things really start to twist. And I know I have let it happen in the past, and things have gone out of control, and I had to deactivate and reactivate, and I've done that like 3 or 4 times now. But it's always my top piece of advice for social media is always stay in control, because the minute you go out of control, that's it. It's a mess. It's hell, literally. It's a toxic place once you're out of control. So you always got to stay in control.
Thank you. And I guess it's given you access to, particularly during lockdown, to other autistic individuals that you wouldn't have been able to communicate with.
Exactly.
Otherwise.
It really has. Otherwise, if lockdown I didn't like lockdown, of course, I hated it, but if lockdown hadn't happened, then I probably wouldn't have got involved in any advocacy work. I wouldn't have been a public figure like I wasn't before I joined Twitter. Literally just after lockdown started, I joined Twitter. So, and then I built it up from there. So lockdown actually really helped me to understand more about autism, and also to connect with other autistic individuals to help me to feel less lonely. Yeah, that's what I personally would say.
That's great. And the person who asked the question said, thanks, great advice. My daughter's here listening with me. It's good to hear those things. That's great. So
I'm glad you love my response. Thank you.
And someone else, thanks, interesting views. Lovely. Okay, I don't think we've got any other questions, do we, Louise?
No, I don't think so.
Lovely. So
we got 9 minutes left, so I can take any questions, literally, because I know lots and lots of people ask me questions on Twitter, like hundreds and hundreds, and I never have the time to respond to them. I know that's the thing about having over 9,000 followers. You get so much every day. So yeah, so I can take questions for the next 8 minutes if anyone wants to ask anything.
We'll just wait another couple of minutes. Otherwise, it might be that you've covered everything, or you've given them so much food for thought that they just need to go and digest it now over the weekend.
Yeah.
Could be that as well.
Yeah.
It is worth pointing out as well, Pavan's social media handles at the bottom there. And I know that a lot of parents, professionals, and autistic individuals follow you, don't they? Because you give that useful insight on a regular basis.
Yeah, and some big organizations. National Autistic Society follows me, Young Minds follows me, Samaritans follows me. So yeah, some big organizations involved in my advocacy work. Yeah.
When Pavan and I when I chat, we have well, Pavan tries to compete, don't you, really, in terms of who follows you, Rebecca? And I have to say nobody, really. You always win those competitions. Someone else said, thank you so much, Pavan, for speaking so eloquently. Lovely.
You're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So I think we'll probably wrap up there. Maybe you can spend 5 minutes replying to your Twitter followers instead. But just to say thank you very much. I think it's really useful. All of the stuff you covered around language and terminology and why that's so important, and how that can make somebody feel included in a situation or excluded. And all the other top tips that you've given. So yeah, do follow Pavan as well. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to come and speak to us all. And we are now going to have an hour lunch break. So we'll be back here at 2 o'clock to hear from Neve, who will be talking about her experiences transitioning to university. So another really, really interesting topic. Probably will be elements that actually we can use for young people transitioning in any point in their lives, whether it's transitioning to secondary or into a workplace. So lots more useful top tips coming this afternoon. Have a lovely lunch break, and we will see you back here at 1 o'clock. Thank you again, Pavan.
Thanks a lot. Glad you all enjoyed it.